Hello, my subject today is neutrality for interpreters. Now mostly we don't think about neutrality very much while we're interpreting, but it is an important subject because it goes to the heart of professional ethics. After all, what is an interpreter? An interpreter is an intermediary, a linguistic and cultural intermediary between a speaker and his audience. And for communication to be effective between that speaker and the audience, the interpreter has to be as transparent as possible, so any personal opinions shouldn't get in the way. But more fundamentally, neutrality is a precondition for trust, especially if speakers express conflicting views. And trust is vital for an interpreter to do his job. We all know the old jibe about traduttori, traditori. Now, of course, neutrality does not imply the absence of opinions, convictions, or prejudices. Interpreters are not citizens of nowhere, but they hang up their opinions, convictions, and prejudices in the cloakroom on the way to the booth, just as they hang up any outward signs of partisan affiliations, like swastikas, the hammer and sickle, or even the more innocent-looking yellow ribbon of Catalonia. And I've deliberately used the same metaphor as Jean-Claude Juncker when speaking about British nationals who are commissioned civil servants. He said that they'd hung up their nationality when they came to work for the Commission, to serve the European cause without any national bias. An illustration of this is what happens in the Brexit negotiations. If I interpret Michel Barnier, the EU negotiator, I am the voice of Michel Barnier, and I'm trusted, despite being British and presumably sounding British. There are no nationality criteria here. So you can be neutral, you can be trusted, even if you belong in some way, if only by your accent, to one side. A citizen of nowhere has no accent, but parce Mrs. May, we're all citizens of somewhere. At this stage, however, I need to qualify the term neutrality. It does not imply that interpreters are in some way überparteilich, above the parties, above the fray. No, interpreters are allparteilich. In other words, they're on everybody's side. In other words, we should interpret Nigel Farage and Jean-Claude Juncker with the same degree of conviction. Interpreters have to be chameleons. We have to become left-wing firebrands, red in tooth and claw, or dyed-in-the-wool reactionaries, depending on who happens to be speaking. I'd go so far as to say that, like those who marry often, we have to display serial fidelity. Of course, it's not easy. I know I have colleagues who get hot under the collar when speakers blaspheme against the pieties of our age. But it's not for us to censure or censor. So far, I've talked only about our Brussels bubble, our cosy microcosm. But sometimes interpreters are caught up in discussions of tragic events. They interpret victims of crimes against humanity, or the perpetrators of those crimes. And this is what happened at the Yugoslavia Tribunal at The Hague. So how can one be neutral? Of course, one doesn't feel neutral. But I was speaking to a Croatian colleague about this. By interpreting faithfully, She was helping the judges to understand exactly what had happened, and therefore the judges were able to do their job, to administer justice and sentence the guilty parties. And she found it easier to be faithful because interpreters at The Hague were encouraged to interpret as literally as possible, without editing or embellishment, because editing carries with it the risk of bias being introduced. A complicating factor in her case was that she was working in the so-called BCS booth, Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian, because the three languages are extremely close. And therefore, this Croatian colleague was sometimes working for the Serbian accused. Now, she was aware that she sounded Croatian, but she tried to pepper her Croatian with Serbian words so that the Serbian client, the accused, would be familiar with the vocabulary she used. Now, was she trusted? Of course, the Serbian accused sometimes objected that he was having to listen to a Croatian interpreter, but generally such objections were overruled by the judges. So this shows that it's not always easy to be neutral, it doesn't always work, and of course it has to be said as well that neutrality can exact an emotional price if you belong to a particular group which is a party to the discussions about crimes against humanity. To conclude, neutrality, or serial fidelity, if you prefer, is an ethical imperative. And I'd say it's easier to achieve if we're humble, if we remember that we are actors, that we're playing a part. And here I quote Shakespeare, "Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his part upon the stage, and then is heard no more." I hope we're more than walking shadows. We're actually very often shadows behind the glass pane. But ideally, our audience should identify us totally with the characters we're playing. It's a tall order, but we should do our best. And ultimately, that is the only ethical course. Thank you.